Hello people of the internet, this is KaijuNoir with a long overdue review for what will be the start of a new series of reviews covering Toho's entire Heisei era of films that lasted from 1984 to 1995. Of course, the first one up to bat is 1984's The Return of Godzilla, also known as simply Godzilla in Japan. Acting as a direct sequel to the original 1954 film, the story begins like your typical Godzilla reboot, where a fishing ship, the Yahata Maru, and its crew go missing in the middle of the sea after a terrible storm. Afterwards, we meet our protagonist Maki, the young, eager, and brash journalist whose goal is to uncover the big scoop. After stumbling across the missing vessel, he finds the decayed remains of the crew, as well as their killer, the mutant sea louse Shokiras. He's saved in the nick of time by the ship's lone survivor, Okamura. After rescuing him, Maki finds himself in the middle of a government-mandated media blackout, where he's unable to get his story published as he soon finds out that this is only the beginning, for the king was finally making his grand return. From there on, Maki, Okamura, his sister Naoko, and biophysics professor Hayashida must find a way to stop Godzilla's rampage before it's too late. What I love most about this plot is how it manages to take the basic premise of Godzilla's reawakening and infuse it with memorable characters, amazing build-up, and political commentary. Starting with our protagonist, Maki is an entertaining character to get behind. During the second act, the audience gets to see the moral dilemmas he faces early on, and how it changes his perception on life. While a good person at heart, he made it his goal to go after the big attention-grabbing story. So when confronted with the possibility that announcing Godzilla's reappearance would lead to terrible consequences, such as the stock market crashing and widespread panic, his moral ambiguity comes into question, especially after he goes out of his way to seemingly reunite Okamura with Naoto out of the kindness of his heart, only to take advantage of them both for the sake of a good story. Despite his good intentions and willingness to expose the truth, he becomes self-aware of his selfish actions, and thus is set on an arc of redemption in helping out Hayashida and escorting Naoto out of the city during Godzilla's rampage. Another character worth mentioning is Hayashida. It's clear that this man is supposed to be this film's Yamane, in that he is there to exposit scientific explanations and play the role of the elder mentor, though unlike Yamane, Hayashida actually grew up with the pain and memories brought about by Godzilla's first appearance in 1954. Because of this, he is intent to kill Godzilla, and sees the kaiju as mankind's responsibility. Now, the best character in my opinion is easily the Prime Minister of Japan. Every line of dialogue he speaks brilliantly reflects the political climate of the 80s, i.e. the tension between America and Russia, or should I say, the USSR at the time. In the film, both countries wish to use their nuclear weapons on Godzilla. However, the Prime Minister believes that they simply want to use Japan as a testing ground for their weapons, and see who ends up wielding the bigger guns since it's not their land. He obviously cares for his country, knowing that they've experienced the horrors of nuclear weaponry firsthand, and thus rejects the plan. Overall, the influences of the Cold War are in full force here, and it works to help modernize Godzilla for the next generation. The use of political commentary adds a level of realism to the film, by treating Godzilla as an international threat, as opposed to a Japanese one. Speaking of the Big G himself, he is resurrected as the malevolent force of nature that fans hadn't seen at that point since the early 60s. Simply put, this is the classic depiction of Godzilla. Right from the get-go, the film slowly builds him up, with an initial ship attack, Okamura describing Godzilla as a living island that rose out of the sea, older characters reminiscing over the original 1954 incident, and eventually the grand reveal at the nuclear-powered facility. In this film, Godzilla moves and acts like a lumbering tornado, slowly tearing apart everything in his path. He's an uncaring beast, soulless, with no sympathy nor remorse. What I find fascinating about this portrayal is that he is not so much a fully sentient creature with the intelligence or self-awareness of a man, but is rather built on an animalistic instinct type of behavior. Whenever he goes on the attack, he does so in search of sustenance, such as the nuclear energy in his initial attack, making this the very first appearance we've actually seen him obtain nutrition of any kind. He is also susceptible to bird calls, as he follows the direction of their frequencies. This does raise some questions as to why he is attracted to them in the first place. Could it be that his species lived in herds and thus relied on this form of communication? If so, does that make Godzilla a more sympathetic creature, in that he's searching for someone like him? One last thing I'd like to bring up about Godzilla is whether or not this is supposed to be the same creature that supposedly died in 1954, or is this the second Godzilla, similar to the one that appeared in 1955 and has since appeared in all of the Showa films since then. As simple as it would be to think that this Godzilla was brought about by Cold War nuclear testing, there are just several factors that prevent me from believing that this is the case. First off, no one in this film ever refers to this creature as a new Godzilla, but rather treat him like he's the original who's come back 30 years later. In the second film, Godzilla Raids Again, Dr. Yamane quickly concludes that the monster from that film is a new specimen. Also, later on in this continuity, where time travel becomes relevant, we still don't hear anyone discussing the existence of two Godzillas, with them acting as if there has always been one. Personally, I like to think that in this continuity, Godzilla must have gone into a coma in 1954 after being exposed to the oxygen destroyer, and wouldn't wake up for another 30 years. Either that or he somehow must have pulled a Superman and was resurrected by means of conveniently contrived writing. But hey, that's just a theory. A G theory.
It just raises too many questions.
As for the special effects and production values, they are a sight to behold, if a little bit dated by 2015 standards. Due to 80s era architecture, the models tower over the suit actor in order to fit in scale with the now 80-meter Godzilla. The model work is still impressive, as are the vehicles, which include the appearance of the Super X, an experimental machine that's basically a heavily armored hover tank, which do just enough to give the film more of that sci-fi edge that fans liked back in the day. Godzilla's roar was upgraded by adding a more realistic growl in the mix, making him all the more intimidating, which happens to make it my favorite roar of his. As for Godzilla's new design, I'm mostly half and half on it. It certainly harkens back to the original 1954 design, such as the ears, posture, and claws, while also giving it its own unique feel. However, my issues with this design lies in its face. I'm sorry to say, but I am not a fan of the eyes. At an angle, they appear passable and work with the large brow, but on shots where he is facing the camera, I can't help but laugh at Derpzilla's expression. While it may be one flaw, it's something that really soils my opinion of the design, as I prefer a Godzilla that looks pissed and ready to kill you, rather than sit there looking like it's about to drool from its mouth. A unique approach made for this film was the creation of a large-scale animatronic Godzilla nicknamed the Cybot Godzilla, made for a few close-up shots. Both the proportions and the face are very different from the suits, but it's still a valiant effort nonetheless, especially when it has much better looking eyes. Whenever those eyes are facing forward onto a target, it adds that extra level of danger for the human cast. The Cybotzilla is at its best when roaring and causing its upper lip to snarl. Its worst moments are whenever its arms are on screen, or pretty much anything below the neck, due to its slow, jerky, and awkward movements. As for the choreography of the destruction sequences, they are executed more slowly than what you might expect from a Godzilla film. He doesn't actively go out of his way to destroy everything in sight, but rather marches along on a single path and happens to smash anything that is in his way, pausing every once in a while whenever he's confronted by resistance. The decision to take things slow may not work with some, but for me, they don't hamper the film one bit, since they help tremendously in treating Godzilla like an unwavering force of destruction, and the score more than makes up for those slow moments. Speaking of which, the score, composed by Reijiro Kuroku, has that timeless and haunting feel that perfectly suits the film's tone. It complements Godzilla as a gigantic embodiment of death, and makes each scene with him all the more intense. The military themes are very heroic and uplifting, something you'd like to hear in the background as you're charging into the battlefield head-on. The film's memorable soundtrack is able to stand on its own without having to rely on the tracks of previous scores, while at the same time also honoring them in its execution. It is unfortunate that this score was never used in future films, but as we'll see later down the line, the reappearance of a legendary composer more than makes up for that. It is important to discuss the American cut of the film, Godzilla 1985, which was produced by Roger Corman and featured the return of Raymond Burr, reprising his role as reporter Steve Martin for the American cut of the first Godzilla film. What's important to note is that Godzilla 1985 was initially intended to be a straight-up comedy. However, Raymond Burr made the production treat Godzilla with at least some amount of respect, otherwise he wouldn't agree to be part of it. Even still, much of the dialogue in the original American footage is littered with hokey dialogue from everyone surrounding Burr, and you can just tell that he himself did not want it to be there. What was also changed was everything that made the story in Return of Godzilla good. This cut skips over important character-defining moments in order to make room for the American scenes. Maki never takes advantage of reuniting and reporting the reunion of Okamura and Naoko, and thus is never given that character arc. The Prime Minister's reason for not allowing nuclear weapons in this version was that it was simply against their law to use them. Without those crucial key moments from the Japanese version, you end up following a bunch of characters who are mainly there for exposition, which is what Raymond Burr was already there for! On top of that, Godzilla 1985 pretty much throws Russia under the bus when it comes to altering the Cold War elements. Before, in the original cut, when a Russian nuke was accidentally launched, a soldier attempts to shut it off, stating that he was the only one who can stop it, shortly before dying in an explosion. However, in the American cut, the dialogue is changed to where he says that he needs to launch it before the film cuts away, showing the nuke launching from space. This scene pretty much solidifies my belief that the purpose of all these edits is to portray America as the heroes for when they use their nuke to stop Russia from destroying Tokyo. Aside from the annoying and unfunny American military personnel and the non-existent Japanese characters, the one thing that truly stands out in all of this is of course Raymond Burr. Much like Hayashida, he convinces you that he was there in the middle of the chaos that went down. His cryptic lines show that the character is still traumatized by those events, and that the actor has much respect for the franchise to give such a performance. Lastly is something I feel like I needed to address. Now I know this may seem like an odd thing to complain about, but whenever I watched Godzilla 1985, I strangely always get the craving for soda. Namely a cola of some sort, like, I don't know, Dr. Pepper or something. Has anyone ever felt this, or am I just going crazy? Yeah, I think I'm going crazy. Anyway, when all is said and done, The Return of Godzilla is hands down the definitive Godzilla reboot. It honors the themes of the original and updates them to reflect the times of which this film was made, all while providing dazzling special effects and highly memorable characters. The American cut, on the other hand, loses what made the Japanese cut so good, but still retains some entertainment value with the inclusion of Raymond Burr and those action sequences. I'm giving The Return of Godzilla a 5 out of 5, and Godzilla 1985 a 3 out of 5. Now, in a strange move, Toho decided to wait another 5 years before we got a sequel. In the meantime, they were working on another project, which actually began life as a rejected Godzilla script. Join me next time when I take a look at Gunhead. Until next time, everybody, take care.